Hi everyone, and welcome to Unit 6, Module 26. We are talking about learning, and specifically we are talking about classical conditioning today. Here are your learning objectives, and here is your vocabulary. So let's get started. So what is learning? Learning is the process of acquiring new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Enduring is a key word there. There are three major types of behavioral learning we'll be talking about in this unit. Classical conditioning, which is this module, operant conditioning, which is in our next module, and observational learning a little later on. So a type of learning is called habituation. An organism's decreasing response to stimuli with repeated exposure to it. Now, this definition sounds so much like sensory adaptation, I know. We just did that unit. However, key difference here, and let me give you an example to kind of point it out. So an example of habituation would be if you are walking down the hall at school and your friend jumps out and says boo. The first time that happens, you might have a big reaction and be really scared and jump, but they do it a second time, a third time, a fourth time. They do it many times throughout the day. The more you are exposed to that jump out and say boo, the less reactive you are to it. That is habituation. And that isn't because your senses have adapted. That is because you have learned something and have adapted. So habituation is about learning. Sensory adaptation, I know it sounds similar, but sensory adaptation, an example of that would be you're in the pool, you get into the pool and the temp is cold, but after a while being in the pool, your body adjusts to that temperature. That's your senses adjusting. With habituation, it's your brain adjusting because it has learned something. We'll be talking about associative learning, and this is learning that certain events occur together. They are linked together. So there are two types of associative learning we'll be talking about. The first is classical conditioning in this module, and that is when we link two stimuli together. That is the linked association. Or in operant conditioning, when we link a behavioral response of ours or someone's to its consequence. So that would be an example of operant conditioning. So let's talk more about these associative learning styles. So classical conditioning, again, is just linking two or more stimuli in anticipation of an event. And that's what we're talking about today. Operant conditioning is when we're associating a response to a consequence. So the mouse here is pushing a lever, and that behavior is producing a consequence of food coming out of that hole. We're going to use the word stimulus a lot, so be very familiar with that word. That word just means any event or situation or thing. It is a thing. It's got to be something that happens. It's a thing. And cognitive learning. This is the acquisition of mental information, whether by observing something, watching someone else, or through language. So we don't always have to be exposed in the same way. So just like someone giving us information, right, that is a form of learning. Or we can watch someone without experiencing it ourselves and learn it. So those are examples of cognitive. All right, let's get to our main focus in this module, which is classical conditioning. So this man on the left here, that is Ivan Pavlov. And he is actually a physiologist, not a psychologist. And he was studying digestion. And he was studying digestion in dogs and using dogs. And he was having a problem where the dogs were salivating before they had their food. And that's where he really discovered classical conditioning, that they were linking the sound of something to the food and salivating without the stimuli of food. So he was like, this is something. And so from there, behavioral psychology kind of took off, especially with the likes of people like John B. Watson. So he is a behavioral psychologist. We'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this module. But he urged his colleagues to dismiss basically that Freudian idea of introspection, of talking about what you see, what you think here, and kind of analyzing that psychoanalysis process. He said that's not very scientific, it's not observable behavior, and behaviorism, that perspective, is all about observable learned behaviors. So that's really where. Okay, so classical conditioning, here is a little example. We are, again, remember, learning to associate, associative learning. We're associating one stimulus with another. So for example, it lightnings and then it thunders. Okay, so those are two stimuli that we are linking together. The first time you see lightning ever, you don't know that thunder is going to follow that. So the more you are exposed to that, the more you see lightning, you expect thunder. So if you were afraid of or anyone really, they might skip right over the thing that actually makes them afraid. So as soon as they see the lightning, they don't even need to hear that scary thunder noise. They just see the lightning and they have a response of fear. So they're linking two stimuli of like, oh my gosh, I'm going to see lightning, then I'm going to hear that loud, scary noise, and that's going to terrify me. So let's take this through using our vocab. So at first, there is a neutral stimulus when we are classical conditioning. And that is something that does not elicit a response. So for example, a flash of lightning might not elicit a natural response of fear, right? It is neutral stimulus. Now, the thing that does cause the fear, the loud thunder sound, that would be an unconditioned stimulus. And that means, so unconditioned, just think unlearned. Unconditioned, unlearned, meaning natural. It is a natural thing that produces a natural reaction. So in our example, the natural thing that causes the dog to be afraid is that loud clap of thunder. That would be the unconditioned stimulus. And then there's an unconditioned response, or an unlearned natural response, which is a reaction to that unconditioned stimulus. And so the unconditioned response here we've been talking about is fear. The fear, here you hear a loud noise, you get afraid, okay? And then there's this neutral thing of the flash of light. All right, so as with repeated exposure to that, there becomes a learned response, a conditioned, so conditioned meaning learned response. And the learned response in this scenario is the fear. So it was our unconditioned response, and it's also our conditioned response. So with repeated exposure to lightning and thunder, they just see lightning and they have a conditioned response of fear. And that conditioned stimulus is the lightning. It is a learned stimulus. It is not a naturally occurring stimulus. Dogs don't just see a flash of light and be afraid and hide under your bed or whatever. They hear the loud thunder, right? And they learn. So eventually they don't need that thunder. They just need that big flash of light and they're like, oh my gosh, scared, run away. Let's take this through Pavlov's dog experiment, or accidental experiment. So he had dog food, and dog food is our naturally occurring stimulus that provokes a response in the dogs of salivating. So this first picture here is before conditioning, meaning before they've learned anything, a dog will see food and his mouth will start to drool. That is just a natural response that a dog will have. And now he's going to pair the seeing of the food with a neutral stimulus, a bell. So the goal here is, can I take this neutral stimulus that doesn't provoke any response and make it provoke a response? Like this, can I make the dog salivate without the dog food ingestion? So the neutral stimulus is just a bell, right? And you test that to make sure it's neutral. So you ring the bell, the dog doesn't salivate, right? It doesn't start drooling to a bell naturally, unlearned. But then you start pairing. So you do bell food, bell food, bell food, and the dog will salivate. It's got to be right together, the bell and the food. Okay, so now they are starting to associate. They're having that acquisition moment where they're realizing there's a link here between that sound and my food. And once they have learned that, so that's after conditioning now it's just that sound of the bell and they start salivating. Is when we take that, we link a neutral stimulus and an unconditioned stimulus. So in the dog scenario, it would be the neutral stimulus being the bell and the food, which is the UCS, so that the neutral stimulus, the bell alone, starts triggering that response, the salivation. In operant conditioning, it's the strengthening of a reinforced response with acquisition. There's also something called higher order conditioning, which is where the conditioned stimulus, so the thing, the learned thing, is paired with a new neutral stimulus. So think of our bell for the dog being paired also like the sound of the door. And that creates a second, often weaker conditioned stimulus. And this is sometimes known as a second order conditioning. So maybe your dog reacts to a door opening and the sound of the food. So those would be like 2. And the first one, the door, being the higher order conditioning. Generalization. So this is the tendency with this type of conditioning. Once they've learned the response, once this has been really conditioned into them, for other stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. So maybe it isn't a bell, maybe it's like a song, a certain tune on a phone or on the TV, a certain sound, and it elicits a discrimination. And this is the learned ability to distinguish between conditioned stimuli and then other stimuli that don't signal the UCS. So they might realize that like, oh, that's just a phone sound. It's just a different sound. It's not the right tone. And so they'll start to distinguish which tone is for food and which is not. And then eventually, if there's not repeated pairing of that conditioned stimulus with the natural, the unconditioned stimulus, if you do that for a really long time without any pairing, so imagine like you do the bell, right, over and over, and you never pair it anymore with the food, eventually you'll have extinction. And that's the diminishing of that conditioned response. The last one is spontaneous recovery. So a behavior can stop. So they could stop salivating to the bell, and then spontaneously, as this graph is showing you, it can occur again, and then maybe it will go down again depending on what happens next. So another person who studied classical conditioning he conducted the Little Albert experiment along with Rosalie Rayner, and they were trying to show how specific fears could be learned or conditioned. And so what they did was they took this baby, Little Albert, and they paired a loud banging sound with a white rat. And after repeated exposure, because at first there was no reaction, the white rat was just a neutral stimulus, baby was curious about it, but after repeatedly pairing whenever he saw that white rat with a really scary loud noise in the background, the baby would just eventually see the rat and get a... Let's practice this. Let's see if you can figure out, and so pause here and see if you can fill in these blanks of what these are. So the loud banging sound is the natural occurring stimulus that produces a natural, an unlearned response of crying or being afraid. What was the neutral stimulus here? The thing that doesn't normally provoke that response is the white rat. This eventually will provoke a conditioned response. This is the goal, unfortunately, to make the baby be afraid when seeing the white rat. So you pair the neutral stimulus, the white rat, with the natural stimulus, the thing that does produce the fear, and get the fear. And eventually, once learned, you just have a white rat. You don't need a sound. You just have, so remember, when you hear the word stimulus, think thing. Classical conditioning, you want to think two stimuli linked together. Two stimuli linked together. Response, you want to think reaction. And UCS, whenever you see that U, whether it's UCS or UCR, you want to think U means unlearned or natural. The neutral stimulus, it must be neutral at first, causing no reaction, becomes a conditioned stimulus. And you always want to think learned when you see conditioned. So a learned stimulus. The natural response, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response are always similar, if not the same. And if you go through and rewind this, you'll see that they were the same. So the UCR and the CR are the same. All right, see you in